Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, a very warm welcome to the Swiss mission to today's Swiss breakfast, a breakfast which today, due to last night's terrible attacks, will be mostly a virtual breakfast. I'm happy to welcome all of those who follow us, of course also those who follow us virtually. I would like to give a very warm welcome to our two panelists. We have on the one hand Madame Alexandra Schur-Schröder from DG FISMA, and we have Mr. Patrick Audier from Switzerland. You know we always have a representative from the EU side and from Switzerland. Today's breakfast, as you probably have seen, is dedicated to the topic Building Bridges, Swiss and EU Approaches to Sustainable Finance. And I would like to start with a few words on building bridges. It is a collaborative effort that aims to advance sustainable finance in Switzerland and around the globe. Building Bridges was launched in 2019 by Swiss public authorities, the finance community, the United Nations, and other international partners to accelerate the transition to a global economic model aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. I think everyone in this room and also those following us are aware of the fact that sustainability in the financial sector is becoming increasingly important. Financial service providers play a key role in the transition towards a sustainable economy and society. Both Switzerland and EU have developed sustainable finance approaches. Today we will learn more about both, and I'm already looking forward to the discussion that will follow. Let me just make a few points in my initial comments on the Swiss approach. Switzerland is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. Its financial center has a key supporting role to play towards this goal. Sustainable finance approaches have focused on ensuring good framework conditions to support the transition of the entire economy. In particular, strengthening transparency and comparability has been at the center of recent efforts to make sure that stakeholders have decision-useful climate information. In this context, a continued and intense dialogue between the private sector and the government maintains a balance between market-driven solutions and the supporting regulatory framework. Over the last years, some major initiatives have been introduced in Switzerland with the aim to achieving these goals. We have mandatory disclosures for large companies, disclosures which are based on the recommendations by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. The disclosures will be based on so-called double materiality, and the first reporting is expected in 2025. Then we have the voluntary Swiss climate scores, launched in June 22, which provide investors with information on the extent to which their financial investments are compatible with international climate goals. A summary is available of those of you physically present here at the back of the room, and we will of course also share it virtually with participants following online. Last but not least, there is also self-regulation of various industry associations in specific areas of sustainable finance. There are, for example, rules for integrating sustainability criteria into investment advice and portfolio management, as well as when giving mortgage advice. So, to conclude my brief introductory remarks, the close cooperation between the private and public sector plays a fundamental role in the transition to a sustainable economy. I look very much forward to an exciting panel discussion, and with these words, hand over to our moderator, Mr. János Allenbach-Ammann. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thanks. Thank you, Ambassador, for this introduction and for hosting us here for this wonderful breakfast that now sadly not everybody can enjoy, but welcome also to those joining us online. My name is János Allenbach-Ammann. I'm economy editor.
Seems like one might go still.
Yeah. Sorry, I hope it's better now. I'm economy editor at Euractiv. It's my pleasure to guide you today through this discussion on the Swiss and the EU approaches on sustainable finance. We have the perfect guests here with Ms. Jo Schröder and Mr. Audier. Thank you both for being here. Let me quickly take you through this program of this breakfast. We will first have introductory remarks by each of you, about 5 minutes each. We'll then have 20 minutes of moderated discussions, and then 20 minutes of questions from the audience, so from you who are here in the audience physically, and also those online. If you are joining us online, please go on Slido. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. We will finish at around 10:30. Let me quickly start with one figure, 1.75 degrees. That's by how much the global average air surface temperature was above pre-industrial average this September. That was the hottest month on record. And it seems like we have just rushed past the Paris climate goals of keeping climate warming below 1.5 degrees. At the same time, CO2 emissions, we all know it, are still increasing. We are still throwing wood on the fire that is cooking the planet. But we also want to reach net zero by 2050. According to different estimations, this will need about 3 to 6 trillion US dollars in additional yearly investments. The EU's strategic foresight report said it's about 700 billion euros yearly for the EU alone. And governments seem either unable or unwilling to put that all on the table themselves. So, of course, private money will play a crucial role if we are to achieve this goal. So, this is quite an important discussion, because if we get it wrong, the planet will be cooked and us along with it. And this is, just one of the planetary boundaries, and we haven't even started talking about the social aspects of sustainable finance. So the challenge for this is clear. We have to choose a good approach, and we have to at least ensure that the different approaches that there are, because it is global, there will be different approaches, that they don't encumber each other. And this is what we'll try to discuss today for the Swiss and for the EU's approach. to get closer to them, I'll hand over to the experts, and I would like to hand you the floor, Mr. Audier.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, ambassadors, for your introduction. I think I would start by saying that the financial sector has not waited, of course, too long before it started thinking about the role it can play in order to ensure that this transition that we're talking about to a more sustainable planet and world takes place. I think that capital, to call it this way, and the financial sector itself is one of the four major levers according to which we can probably hope having an effect. All the facts are known. All the indicators are known to all of us. We know that we have in front of us a major change of paradigm, that all industries in the world will be concerned, including the financial sector. That's why in Switzerland in particular, this reasoning has started quite early in discussing what could be the intervention of the financial sector in this respect. As early as in the middle of the 90s, was created in Switzerland one of the first instruments to allow pension funds to invest in a sustainable way. That was the foundation Ethos, which still exists today, which has become a very active foundation today in Switzerland, making sure that the dialogue and engagement with investing company could develop as efficiently as possible. This foundation is still a good example of the early stage involvement of the financial sector, because it was created by the financial sector, bringing public and private pension funds together to make sure that discussions with corporate sector can take place. In addition, microfinance has started also to play a role in the late 90s, early 2000, and that's also a domain where Switzerland has been quite active, developing expertise, along, of course, the blended finance and impact finance expertise that also have developed in Switzerland quite early. It is important to remember that the financial sector is, if you wish, one of those four levers, and alone the financial sector cannot achieve the goals that we're all trying to set for ourselves and for our planet. The others are, of course, as you know, production or the producers or corporate sector, and the consumer, the technology that has to be put at use, and finally, of course, the political and regulatory aspects. When it comes to political and regulatory aspects, Switzerland has taken the view that the bottom-up approach is probably better than the top-down. That's not something very different from the pragmatism that Switzerland has always had. Industry should be, in this case, the financial industry should be a force of proposal. And that's why we have developed in Switzerland a number of initiatives that came from the industry rather than had been waiting for our governments or regulatory authorities to propose their solutions. And I think in this respect, this is exactly what is happening now. The financial sector authorities and our Federal Department of Finance has decided that the strategy of the financial sector should be, among others, a strategy based on leading the efforts in sustainable finance, and has asked actually the private sector to come up with proposals before even intervening from a regulatory point of view. And that's exactly where we stand today. And that has led to self-regulatory frameworks that have been developed by banks, by asset managers, and by insurance in particular, that are being implemented, analyzed and monitored to make sure that they bring results that are satisfactory from a global governance point of view. It is too early to tell if it is the case, but what can be said is that Switzerland has a long tradition of self-regulation. It's probably one of the few countries in the world where self-regulation has some credibility and has shown that it is being working. If you take, for instance, the domain of money laundering, this is in Switzerland that was developed the first framework against money laundering, which has led in turn to the European framework that was then developed in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s in this respect. There's no reason why we should think that thinking about it this way could not lead to also additional or complementary standards to the one that the European Union has been developing. The EU having been, as you all know, from a technical point of view, a leader in developing these standards. That's also why the industry in Switzerland, the financial industry, is of course looking at those standards as being the one of reference. The Swiss financial sector is an export industry. The ones of the members of this industry that are present in Europe have, of course, adopted the European standards. And the aim of the financial industry in Switzerland is to make sure that there's mutual recognition between what could additionally be proposed by the Swiss financial sector and what exists already in Europe, and no contradiction or opposition. Perhaps a word about where we stand in terms of bringing all those parties together. Indeed, Building Bridges was created 4 years ago in order to bring all stakeholders around the table to do what? To do, first of all, to present solutions that could be interesting for all stakeholders, to learn about perhaps new developments that can be useful for any of the stakeholders, and finally to meet with colleagues and like-minded either actors and or stakeholders that together could make the difference. This year was a particularly interesting edition of Building Bridges. We got roughly 2,500 participants during a week of 4.5 days that allowed us to have over 70 different sessions plus a summit, where we also attracted two very important international conventions. One was the TNFD, the European launch of the framework of the TNFD happened in Geneva last week. And also we were privileged enough to be able to host the second Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue of the UNFCCC that, as you know, is preparing the discussions of the financial days at the COP28. So this idea of bringing everyone under a same roof at one point in time during the year is not only an idea of trying to make sure all points of view are being gathered and can be helpful, trying to even strengthen the efficiency potential of measures that are proposed, but it's also there to make sure that if there's points on the agenda that could be added and or changed or modified in a constructive way, these points can be added to the agenda before the big conferences and policy-making conferences do start. So I think in this respect, we look forward to, out of Switzerland, play an active role in trying to bring all those actors together. Switzerland benefits, and Geneva in particular, from an extraordinary, unique ecosystem with all the international organizations being gathered at the same place, plus over 700 NGOs, and of course a civil society, financial sector and corporate sector added to the academia that can make the difference in some of those thinkings. So in a nutshell, Switzerland is trying to lead the way, of course in a collaborative way with the European framework and the European Commission, which has been leading some of the technical aspects of that development, and we look forward to being progressing together.
Thank you very much, Mr. Odier, for your explanations. Now, please, Ms. Jo Schröder.
Yes, thank you very much, and a very good morning to all of you. And I would also join Patrick in thanking the Swiss Mission for organizing this very nice breakfast, and sorry for those who cannot participate and have to have their own breakfast before the screen. But basically also because we feel that we have to keep the momentum when it comes to sustainable finance. It is an important subject, but there are always other crises happening. And when it comes to sustainability, we are more or less faced with an abstract danger. It's coming. We know that the planet is heating up. As it was said in the introductory statement, we can see it ourselves. It's not just something that happens in other places. And we have to act, and we have to act quite quickly. And therefore, it is always very useful to compare notes to see where we are. This is a global issue. It's not just an issue for Switzerland and the EU. But I'm very much convinced, and that's why I'm happy that we are here today, that we can also play a role on the global scene and explain what we are doing and what are our tools and ideas to address climate change, but not only the climate issues, but there are also, of course, a lot of environmental challenges. For example, biodiversity is becoming also, the loss of biodiversity is becoming more and more an issue. And as Patrick said it, and I can only join, I think this is really a common effort. So we need everybody, the financial sector, the corporate sector, but also, let's say, everybody, to actively join this process towards a transition to a low carbon economy. There's, of course, certainly the issue of public money, and public money will be needed, but we see this very much going in tandem with the need that there is also private money invested alongside in sustainable activities. And I think it's fair to say that over the years we can really see that there has been a much and more growing private interest in sustainable investment for institutional investors, but also for retail investors. But in the EU, we have found that we need to give these ideas, this interest, a bit more as a framework for sustainable finance, which provides predictability, consistency, and also sufficient clarity. It is certainly clear, and I also wanted to be very clear on that there are a lot of champions already who are really investing in sustainability. That can be the corporate sector, but also, I can say the financial sector has had a very good uptake, but of course it's not across the board. And there are also reasons why others may be a bit ahead and others may follow a bit later. But therefore, to somehow give a stable environment, we thought it would be better to have at least proportionate legislation, regulation in place. I think we are neither top-down nor bottom-up. We are something in the middle. And I mean, we wanted not something that, and one could have done it to say, okay, we force the sector to invest this and that percentage in green technologies. That's not what the EU has done. But we wanted to work with a number of tools that have a bit of a, let's say, a sort of soft pressure, but more in a positive way that we give incentives. And of course, I could speak 5 hours about that, not 5 minutes. And possibly most of those who are listening here know, but maybe just to repeat that are basically 3 main pillars that form our EU strategy. One is the EU taxonomy. Maybe we will come back later to this, a classification system, a definition system to avoid that in the end each and everybody defines what is sustainable, what are sustainable investments. So to have some guidance here. But of course the taxonomy is not binding. It can be used, but it must not be used. Where we are a bit more stringent is when it comes to disclosures, because we have created a very comprehensive disclosure regime, maybe also more later in our discussion. And we have done this because this is not something that is completely new. I mean, there is already a lot of disclosure happening in the financial sector, and everybody working in finance knows there are prospectus obligations, there are reporting obligations, and we have somehow channeled the sustainability reporting into this disclosure regime, and there are different rules what needs to be disclosed when, by whom, and there is certainly this is certainly a process we have to continue, and a bit of early days here. And I realize also that sometimes the machinery is a bit difficult to manage, but we are certainly we are aware of that and happy to do that together with the industry. And the last big building block of our strategy is about say what you're doing, especially if you do good things. It is basically about labels and benchmarks. Maybe one very prominent example is a green bond standard. What I could say today is that we see that the system is working. We see companies and also financial institutions in the EU starting to use the standard, to comply with the standard. I think we have with also the rules on transparency about risks that may affect a company business model when it comes to sustainability. I see also quite a good take up. We have now, and I think that's positive news, the European Green Bond Standard in place. The European Parliament adopted it last week. Again, it's a voluntary standard. Nobody is obliged to do it, but if it's used, of course, it has to follow a number of rules. Maybe to complete my first introductory statement, I mean, we are doing a journey. This is not a one-off process. It's not that some regulation is done and then everything works perfect. We want to do this journey together with the financial industry and the corporate industry. And there are also a couple of challenges we have to overcome to make this commonly a success. One of the challenges is certainly to make it work on the ground. There are, as I said, some concerns that it may somehow be overly complex. We are working on that, and we see also now, of course, as the rules get into implementation, maybe that here and there things look good on paper, but once it comes to the practical implementation, there needs some fine-tuning. But I also wanted to say we don't think we need a complete overhaul. I think it's more to make the system working. Second point is we really have to still be mindful that we avoid greenwashing. It is a fact if you start something new that there may be a temptation to sell things greener as they are, and we have to do this in a balanced way. But it's very important for us that we avoid misinformation, and therefore we also have the green bond standard, but certainly the taxonomy. But this is also something we have to look into. My third, and then I stop here, issue is how we bring our EU approach into the global environment. I think that is a quite important topic, but also a challenge. I mean, first of all, we want to be a front runner. We want to lead in Europe of sustainable finance. But on the other hand, we are not alone, and our companies, our financial institutions are also operating globally. Many things are happening also at the global level, but in sometimes a certain different path. So how can we make it happen that our EU ideas, our EU strategy, which we consider bringing a big added value to the overall challenge we have, can somehow fit into the overall global context. So quite a lot of things for discussion today, I would say.
Thank you very much for these very helpful introductory comments to both of you. Now, I'd like to turn to you, Mr. Odier, first, because, I mean, a lot of banks still holds polluting assets. Why should people trust banks in this self-regulatory approach that banks will actually do the job and get us to net zero fast enough?
Well, I think this is a very good question. I think we have to realize that we have to have a transition in the discussion that goes from black or white or green or brown to a transition. Where do we want to go, and what is the time frame within which we need to go there? And I think when you do that, of course, you will find yourself having today still a picture of that film that will show you examples or counter examples of what is not in conformity with an ultimate objective. But what is very important is the alignment of the strategy of the investment in which you are to these objectives. And that's exactly what is the position today of at least the financial sector in Switzerland, which is basically to say, let's have the tools and standards that allow us, one, to make sure that the corporate sector in which we are either invested or to which we are granting credit, has defined its ultimate objectives with a credible strategy to get there. And then let's develop the tools to make sure we monitor and can monitor the way those companies are reaching their objectives. If they do it in this way, it will not be a surprise to still find some of the positions in portfolios of some of the banks that are in industries that ultimately should transition from brown to green. That's the easy answer. The other aspect, which is, I think, very interesting in this respect, is that we all know that whether we like it or we don't like it, there are transformation of business models that have to take place in industries that will remain industries that create damages to the planet. if you look at materials, for instance, that are so important, you will still need plastic, you will still need aluminum, you will still need cement, you will still need steel tomorrow, because we're still constructing. You need housing, because you need for even your health. You need instruments that are now being built with some of these materials. What is important is that technology has been encouraged and financed in the right way to make sure this transformation or transition can take place. And that's also where I think the financial sector can perhaps play a very interesting role. Let me make a genuine comment here, which I think is important. From an investment point of view, I think the most important attitude by the financial sector is to recognize that investing in a sustainable way, according to the criteria we just discussed, is the best way to invest. That's it. It doesn't have necessarily to have an immediate connection with the fact that we are, by doing so, going to save the planet. It has first and foremost to do with the fact that not doing so, we will take risks that are that are very incompatible with the fiduciary responsibility that most of the financial sector has. The second aspect has to do with credit. Giving credit to industries that are deemed to transition, i.e. to reduce their scope and perhaps disappear, is of course implying a huge risk ahead. And that's why the financial sector has all interest to make sure that it develops the tools and the objectives and the monitoring of these objectives that are necessary to manage those risks. Just want to make that point clear, because yes, there are ultimately societal goals, but the financial sector has essentially a role to allow those companies in which they invest or grant credit to make the transformation that will, one, reduce risk for society in general, but for the bank and bank's clients in particular, and two, to offer the huge returns opportunities that are ahead by this transformation of paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way, because I mean the mechanism you mentioned seems logic. Is there a way to control that? Maybe we can say, if this and that happens in 5 years, we can say, okay, this worked, or no, we have to change. Is there a way we can?
Yeah, that's a very good point. One part of the role of the financial sector is also to get into what we now we've defined as an engagement strategy, i.e. stewardship, talking to as shareholders, if you wish, or active shareholders, or representing active shareholders, talking to the companies to make sure that they have, or even from time to time, helping those companies set the right objectives, monitoring those objectives, but also making it clear that if those objectives are not being met, then of course investment will cease or credit will not be provided anymore. And you know, for instance, in our country, we just through Swiss Sustainable Finance, which is the top association for the financial actors, whatever those actors are, from banks to asset managers to impact investors in Switzerland, over 240 members today. We have developed, together with the Asset Management Association of Switzerland, a guide for all those actors on how to engage in the dialogue, active dialogue with companies, not to be advocates, but to be somehow encouraging those companies to transform themselves and to make sure those companies understand that if they're not doing it, capital will become much more expensive.
Ms. Jorschroeder, why has the EU taken a more prescriptive approach than, for example, the Swiss?
Well, it's not because we think that legislation is the only way in achieving solutions, but I think what we have in mind is that the industry needs somehow a bit more predictability and not simply leaving it to the market in order to get somehow to a more harmonized approach. And I mean, was interesting, especially saying, okay, how can you measure? And I think this is, of course, maybe a bit of an advantage also, having legislation in place with the possibility to review, with, of course, having data collections. And this is not just for the sake for red tape and collecting data, but after a certain moment in time, you are more easily able to see what works, what may not work. And I can say from our experience now, because also in the EU we are still in quite early days. I mean, we started basically 5 years ago with the different elements I have briefly explained. But we can now already see from the reporting that started a bit later that this is taken up. Maybe I give you an example, although I mean, we are still in a very early stage with the reporting data, but we can see it a bit in using the EU taxonomy standards. And that's certainly not maybe a platinum standard, but it's certainly something that companies are using on the ground. And my latest figure here, just to give you one, is that we can see that 63% of companies that are listed on the Stoxx Europe 600 are now reporting taxonomy-aligned figures already. And there are also others who somehow report what we call a non-zero alignment yet, so a bit less. It's 30%. And what is perhaps even more encouraging is that in these 30% of companies reporting non-zero alignment, 23% have taxonomy-aligned capital expenditure, 24 taxonomy-aligned operational expenditure. So, I mean, that is just one example, but I think this shows that it is working. But for us, and coming back to your question, it also shows that what we have done so far in the EU allows us to have a monitoring to see, okay, does it work, what may not work, and therefore give this somehow a frame. Again, I mean, it's not that it's not allowed to do things on a voluntary basis. And we have also tried with our EU system to let nobody behind. And of course, there is a lot of discussion. And as you know, some feel it should have been much more ambitious. Others feel we could have done a bit less. So it's always a bit the question of the golden middle you need to find. But all in all, I think from our approach, we see this well taken up by the industry. We see a need to have at least a basic legal regulatory system in the EU. But of course, if companies feel that they could even go further, this is of course not forbidden.
Thank you. Just a quick reminder for those joining us online that you can put your questions on Slido. We will start taking them in a couple of minutes. So if you have anything that's on your mind, just share it with us. I just have another question for you, Ms. Joschroeder, because you have mentioned it, that there have been more and more complaints now in the recent months, I'd say, from companies that there's regulatory burden, especially these disclosure and reporting requirements. Do you think the EU has overshot here a bit, or will there be adjustments?
Yeah, I think this is actually a normal process in a democracy that we start putting something in place. We see how it works, and if there are issues in the application on the ground, we see what we can do. I mean, I would, however, like to say that we are still in the early days. We have started basically with the financial sector. Maybe we should have done it the other way around, to do the corporate sector first, because the financial sector, of course, needs the data from the corporate sector. But okay, I mean, it is now coming. We have the CSRD in place, and you know, we are also in the process, and hopefully it will happen quickly, that we have these first European sustainable reporting standards that are still in the scrutiny phase by our co-legislators, but I'm hopeful that we'll have them adopted soon. I think the basic issue is a bit about what needs to be disclosed, and the question of the sequence. And I think both are issues we have already taken into account, especially now when it comes to these first reporting standards that concern the corporate sector. And you can see that because we have entrusted a very highly reputed standard setter, EFRAG. And they have done this in a scientific way, developed standards, but not everything what the standard setter has done has been put into the legal text. And especially we have done it so in the way that we wanted to address the concerns we have heard after the consultation of the standards started. And there were basically a few things. I mean, first of all, who needs to report? Is there a difference between big companies and smaller companies? I mean, again, our EU legislative framework is basically designed for bigger companies or those who are listed at the stock exchange. But of course, there may somehow be sometimes an indirect effect if SMEs are in the supply chain. So we have already addressed that in making a number of disclosures that have been proposed by EFRAG voluntary instead of mandatory. I was mentioning the SMEs in particular. They're not in the scope of new reporting requirements, and I think this is something we need to see with them, but also maybe with the other players, how we can do that by not giving them too much administrative burden, but sometimes not to have the missing link. I think this is a bit of a challenge we need to look into. Therefore, on the contrary, we often see that there is a request coming from the industry saying, give us a bit of security. I mean, it's nice to have a taxonomy regulation, but it's all very high-level principles, and we want to use them, but we want to do this rightly. So please be more precise in the end. What is a sustainable investment? When this is a very basic example I'm making, and therefore also to include more and more activities in our framework. It's not an easy task, I can say, because sometimes this is of course very much dependent on the scientific evidence we have. Some sectors are more sensitive than others. So all in all, it's a long journey. It's a constant process we are in. But I would really, again, and to close here, avoid that there is a bit of a, let's say, perception that this is all too complicated, burdensome, and we should stop. This is not the case in our view, but we have to fine-tune here and there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Mr. Audier, in Switzerland there has been this push for these Swiss climate scores. Can you maybe tell us a bit what they are and how they maybe also interact with the EU's standards?
Well, first of all, I think this idea of having Swiss climate score, again, is an initiative that comes from the industry and basically says, alongside the task force for carbon-related financial disclosure, a number of methodologies have been developed by financial players. They've been analyzed by the portfolio alignment team of Mr. McCartney. They've been determined as being the right way to measure the impact that a strategy or company strategy can have on reaching some of the objectives. So it should be something interesting to use by the industry. Looking at this work that had been done within the TCFD, Switzerland said, well, then why don't we use some of these methodologies to replace what is a pure snapshot of a green or non-green type of vision of a company by an analysis and an understanding of the transition or the alignment of this company to the ultimate objectives that have to be reached. And to give you an example, you probably all heard about the implied temperature rise methodologies. Today, you can qualify a company not necessarily only by saying it's green or not green or partially green or not green. It's actually quite difficult to do that, frankly speaking, and the European Union knows that because out of 6, only 2 of these taxonomy standards have yet been developed. So it's a complex definition, whereas the contribution to the elevation or diminishing temperature of the planet is the simple result of a methodology. It can be a right or a wrong methodology, but can be accredited scientifically. So Switzerland said, let's try this approach, and let's not take one measure. Again, it should be principle-based and not either technology or methodology-based. Let's try to see what are the methods that can allow a portfolio to be aligned to these ultimate goals, and let's make a mix of those methods and simply say to the actors, if you are using, in order to construct your portfolios, these kinds of methodologies to demonstrate that the portfolio is a sustainable portfolio in the sense of having the chance to reach the objectives, you can do so. If you're not doing it, you will not be qualified as a sustainable investor if you're a specialist. And I think this is an interesting approach. It's been tested now. It's been in evolution. It so happens that there are 8 or 9 methodologies that are competing, which is also a good thing to have, i.e. competing scientifically approved and accredited methodologies that contribute to the best way to analyze how a company is ultimately going to reach or not reach the objectives for the planet, whatever those objectives are. And of course, there are criteria that you can choose. Temperature is one, but there are others that you can choose. There is a set of criteria that can be used to set the objectives and the measurement. Perhaps one word on the complexity. Sustainability is a complex issue. It took years and years and years to come to a simple figure, which is 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. Okay, why? By the best brains in the world, because it's a complex issue. We hope now with the TNFD to come up with something similar, hopefully, but we now already have at least the frame within which investors can work when it comes to nature. I hope that this frame that has now been defined will benefit from the work that has been done on the climate side to be much more effective on the nature side, which, as you know, is probably one of the best response to climate. Now, there's an element of complexity that comes also from the multiplication of standards, not only from the regulation itself. And the multiplication of standards comes very often from a confusion as per what should we really try to achieve. Should we achieve a portfolio that can be qualified green because we have a strict enough definition of what is green or not green? Or should we try to flow capital to the best destination that will ultimately make the planet greener, or the industry it is which greener? I think it's the second and not the first. So I think, again, by looking at the complexity, which is a sort of a child problem of a new development that we all have today, I think we should step back a little bit and just start to think again about the ultimate objective that we're trying to pursue. What we're trying to pursue is to unlock capital towards the right destination, whether industry or country or region of the world, that will help alleviate some of the huge problems that these climate and nature-related issues do bring to us, and make sure that we can prevent the negative impact of the current growth system to continue to damage the planet. That's what we have to do, and unlocking capital means that we have to be innovative and not necessarily have the same standards for everything we're talking about.
Thanks. I would like to open the discussion to questions. Are there questions in the room? Yes, so there's one here. Please quickly present yourself and tell us to whom you address the question.
Stéphane Rotier, HSBC. It's fantastic what you're doing in Europe and Switzerland, but if everyone has its own standards and applies also standards that are becoming that have extraterritorial consequences, isn't there a risk that there is too much fragmentation of the financial system and that you don't have sufficiently access to capital to finance all the needs where it is being done? Are we not moving towards a system where that everyone is a bit inward looking and that the system becomes too fragmented?
Thanks. And I will just take the second question over there as well. Then we can.
Thank you. Daniel Bolder from the German Property Federation. I would actually like to take up on 2 points of what Ms. Jo Schröder said and Ms. Odier as well. You said the green. The question is, do we want to define something as green, and then we have to get the capital there because it's defined as green, or how do we get capital to the right place to do the best for the planet? And Mr. Schröder, you said also that we need indeed to invest into sustainability and to give the right incentives. And that is some crucial points if you look at the taxonomy today, because I wouldn't say, I wouldn't fully agree what you said, Mr. Schröder, that it is a very high level framework. I think it's actually in some areas very detailed. Like if you look, for instance, for the real estate sector, which I represent from the German perspective, it defines, the taxonomy defines very narrowly what is a building which is taxonomy compliant, which is green. And I'm inclined to say too narrowly, because if you want to comply with these standards, you have to be, I mean, the standards are basically very tough, which means if you are a fund, a bank, an insurance, which wants to invest into green and wants to have the taxonomy label, they will shy away from like 85% of the European building stock because it's not taxonomy compliant. And it is, due to the rules which the taxonomy sets today, very tough to get there. So that is actually currently a framework which is contradictory to what both of you said and rightly said. And I think it's an example where we have to rework the taxonomy. And I'm very happy to hear that you said, indeed, it's a journey, of course. It's not set into stone. So that's on the one hand something where I would suggest let's think about that specific part. And if we're talking about real estate, it's like 38% of CO2 emissions in Europe. So it's a very important part if you want to reach the Green Deal objectives. We also have some ideas how this could be fixed, and we are already in discussion with specifically your colleagues from DG ANA and also some from DG FISMA. So I would suggest that indeed let's think about that again. And my question basically to Mr. Schröder would be, what is the next steps in terms of the taxonomy? When will it be reopened? When will there be some discussion? And will there be the same process like before with the platform? Or because some stakeholders, as you certainly know, felt it was a little bit not always as transparent as a process as one would wish. So what will be the opportunities for stakeholders to get into that process, even if you're not a member of the platform? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to summarize these two questions. Maybe one was on the fragmentation of standards, and we also have here one online about the international alignment of standards, and I think I'd like to hear both of you on this, and then maybe also a specific question on how the taxonomy will be developed, because that has also been asked in Slido. So maybe to you first, Mr. Odier.
Thank you. Fragmentation is, of course, the enemy of everything we want to do. And that's why we have to be convincing about the approach and then about the choice of methodology and or standard that we want to bring. The good news is that this has been recognized. And all the recent efforts, we haven't talked about it yet, but all the recent efforts that are going to be completing the set of standards that is already existing are going in the directions of avoiding multiplications of reporting, avoiding multiplications of standards. And when we talk about qualitative and quantitative standards today, we know that we have to make it simple for the corporations and the economic actors to report on both counts, and if possible at the same time. That's exactly what, by the way, the ISSB has done really remarkably well in the last few months. And it's very good news to hear that the ISSB is now taking over the TCFD work and will probably, I hope, at least we heard some remarks in this respect in Geneva at Building Bridges 2 weeks ago. I think it will probably do the same with TNFD. And I think if we're going in that direction, it's simply because everyone recognizes that too many standards kill the standards. And you're absolutely right, we should avoid that. Now, it's true to say that sometimes the good standards come from places we didn't suspect. I mean, if you look at, for instance, what some of the fixed income markets have done and lately, it's interesting to see that areas such as China have been leading some of the development of standards as well in this respect. Whether these will be the prevailing standards tomorrow or not, I don't know. But the fact is that the demand there for those kinds of instruments is very high. And if it is very high, it needs some standards. And the fact that it will lead to standards will make the discussions with European standards, or the green bond market, for instance, even more productive. So I think here at least I think the industry recognizes the problem, and I'm sure the regulators do as well recognize this fragmentation. We don't need too many standards, we need the right ones. And we don't need standards for standards, we need standards when it comes to making sure, again, the capital flows in the right direction. So maybe an additional quick comment. One of the differences perhaps between Switzerland and the rest of the world in this respect, especially Europe, but please, Alexandra, correct me, I think that we're not approaching it from an industrial policy point of view. I.e., we're not saying, investors, you should go in that industry, this industry, and that industry, and that's why we call it green. We tell simply investors today, if you have to do something, is to make sure that capital contributes to accelerate the transition towards business models that are more sustainable. That's all we want to do. And the reason why capital is interesting to do that is because it's a core investment conviction and nothing else. It is a conviction that by doing so, capital is going to take less risk and capital is going to reach better return ultimately in time. I just want to make that point because I think it's very important. The Swiss, sorry to say, hate industrial policy. I mean, Ordnungspolitik, as we say in good English, in Switzerland means no industrial policy. So in the field of sustainability, I can tell you that Switzerland will always avoid making sure that an industry will be qualified as a good or a bad industry or a green or brown industry.
Thanks.
Maybe very quickly on this very important question indeed on standards fragmentation. I agree with Patrick, we should avoid fragmentation, but you know the world is also not so simple, and I think the best would of course be if we could agree on a global scale that we would have an ambitious standards that apply across the board, but I think that is a bit too much wishful thinking because also the jurisdictions come from different ways. So I think the challenge is in the end that we in Europe, but also, and we work actually well with Switzerland. Absolutely. I mean, this is, there are no contradiction, that we go ahead having standards that allow us to achieve our ambitious goals while not in the end creating something that makes it very difficult for companies also investing in internationally. I think what we have done now, I think it's a quite good example, although we have to see how it works in practice, is that we have, when we come to the corporate standards, had a very close dialogue with the ISSB that has developed the standards in the same time as we have done it in the European Union. And at least I would say from what we see now, there is a high degree of interoperability. Does not mean that it's 100% identical, especially the double materiality that was mentioned by you is not so prominent in the ISSB standards. But at least I think what we have tried is not to give up on our ambitions, because that was something we wouldn't do, but on the other hand also listen to the industry, that we don't have, so to say, two parallel trains that are going in the right direction. I think it's important that we keep on the dialogue with our international partners in the international fora. G20 working group on sustainable finance is a good example, but also the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, where we have also very close contacts with Switzerland. So again, this is not something you can settle in one goal, but it's very, very present. Also, once we start doing something, that we are not losing sight, but also see what's happening on the global scale. And maybe very quickly to the point on buildings and taxonomy. Maybe I expressed myself wrongly. I mean, I didn't want to say that the taxonomy is only high-level principles. I wanted to say that the overall framework sets principles, but then, of course, it's translated, and I agree with you, in very, very detailed requirements. Again, I think this is something we have to see. The proof of the pudding comes with the eating, that once we see how it is applied. And again, I mean, we will continue to have new delegated acts, as we call them here. It takes some time because it's a very complex process. First of all, to have, let's say, the necessary data, but then also to agree on what is green or not green. But this is something that is not a one-off, and so we're happy to continue on that path.
Okay, thanks. I'll like to take one more question here, and I'll take one from the thing, but please be quick because we have we are quite short in time.
Hi, my name is Bert Haig from BBVA, the Spanish bank. And I have a question concerning the transition finance models you mentioned. And the question is to the Commission, because the reporting we have currently, the green asset ratio, for example, they're rather static. And we would like to accompany the companies towards a transition path. So what are your thoughts on this, on creating a transition finance framework that would enable accompanying companies that today are not green, so would harm us actually?
This is a perfect question because it's quite similar to one we have online. Here somebody asks, which measures, tools would be helpful to increase investments in the transitional activities? And does the Commission have plans for the next term in this regard? So I think the number one of these goes to Mr. Odier and the second to Ms. Schroeder. And I give you 1 minute each.
Well, transition is actually the new language we should have to make sure we avoid those confusions of standards about whether it's green, not green, blue, or other color. I think transition, it's not to say that the standards that are existing now cannot be improved and will not be improved. I think they're very useful for some reasons, but when it comes to allocating again capital to the right direction, we must talk about transition, because otherwise the risk is that measures and regulatory measures will be acting against this deployment of capital, either because investors will not understand where they should invest, or because actors will refrain from taking initiatives that are not yet completely safe from a regulatory point of view. Actually, the headwinds exist already. We should absolutely avoid that now what has been started effectively in the financial industry is being stopped or slowed down by a confusion about what is it that we're trying to achieve. And you see it in North America, you see it in other places over the world. Some of the commitments are already being questioned. Some companies are getting out. It's very bad, actually. Even Article 6, 8, 9 are subject to reflections, and you know very well, even better than I do, simply because actors don't want to take the risk. So transition is about making sure the objective is being agreed, and the way this objective is being reached is monitored with credibility and with audit capacity that will make it credible from an investment and regulatory point of view. And that's what we're trying to achieve in Switzerland in particular.
1 minute. First, I think we have started in a quite strict way, saying is something green or something not green. And we have done it so because we wanted to avoid all the difficulties we already see now in terms of definitions, what is the scientific background. That does not mean that we would not think about transition. I think the issues we are already facing now in avoiding greenwashing, giving clear guidance to industry, need to be seriously looked into if I want to start a sort of third category on transition. That does not mean we should not do it. I think it's simply something we are already on. You were mentioning the platform. The platform is looking into that. That is certainly something we will look into in the next mandate of the next Commission. But it is not it's a concept that needs to be clearly thought through. In the end, that not everybody will say, yeah, I'm on the transition to something, and in the end it's not really happening. And therefore it certainly needs some time to develop a good concept.
And that's where perhaps the Swiss climate score could be useful as a discussion tool for these further steps. So we look forward to exchange on that.
There are certainly many ideas, and I think the more we are also implementing and applying the current framework, the more this will also give us food for thoughts whether we would need something nuanced and a bit differently.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives here, Ms. Schroeder, Mr. Odier. Thank you for being here physically and online. For those of you online, there is a poll that you can give your feedback on how you liked this discussion. Thank you very much to the team of the Swiss Mission for hosting us. and have a wonderful day.